Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of St James Ethics Centre, I'd like to welcome you all here this evening to the City Recital Hall, Angel Place, for the second debate in the 2012 series of IQ2 Australia Debates. My name is Simon Longstaff. I'm the Executive Director of St James Ethics Centre, and I'm delighted to chair the debate tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, the motion before this House is that we've seen the energy future and it's nuclear. For the affirmative, leading off is Ben Hurd, the founder of Think Climate Consulting. He's joined by Michael Angwin. Now, Michael's Chief Executive of the Australian Uranium Association. And finally, joined by Professor Daniela Sterlik, Danny, a Professor of Sociology who was recently Foundation Director of the Northern Institute at Charles Darwin University up in the Northern Territory. Leading the argument against the motion, we're very privileged to have with us, visiting from Tokyo in Japan, Dr. Fumihiko Yoshida. He's the Deputy Director of the Editorial Board of Japan's major daily newspaper, Asahi Shimbun. He's joined by Dominique Lafontaine, Vice President, Communications and External Affairs with Repower Australia, one of Australia's leading wind power companies and part of Global Wind Energy Corporation, Suzlon. And last but not least is an Australian who I think really needs no introduction, Professor Ian Lowe, AO, FTSE. He's Emeritus Professor of Science, Technology and Society at Griffith University, President of the Australian Conservation Foundation. Please welcome all of the speakers. I now invite the first speaker for the affirmative, Ben Hurd, to address the House.
I first began looking into the future of energy a few years ago. In the suite of options that I was looking at, being renewable energies, energy efficiencies and carbon offsetting, without some extra major additional force to come in and help the effort, these solutions were not going to so much as touch the sides of meeting this problem. And this was deeply concerning to me. Renewable energies are growing very, very quickly, but from a very low base. Energy efficiency works and works well, but it's slow and incomplete and imperfect. Offsetting is a very good short-term strategy where a lot of good can be done, but currently our government is treating it like a long-term strategy out to 2050, and for a range of reasons that's destined to fail very badly. I needed to come back and look at an option that I hadn't permitted myself to see up to that point, which was nuclear power. In 3 years of doing a Masters of Sustainability at one of Australia's best universities, it was never discussed as a potential option for meeting the climate change challenge in Australia. I had to come back and take myself on a research journey about nuclear power to see whether or not it could meet that gap, and what I learned amazed me. I found out, first of all, that it is a zero carbon power source, at least to the exact same extent that we regard renewable energy sources as a zero carbon power source. This has been repeatedly assessed and demonstrated. I thought the opposite. I was wrong. The idea that nuclear power is high carbon across the life cycle is a false meme. I found, contrary to everything that I thought I knew, that nuclear power is the safest major energy source in the world. Again, this has been repeatedly assessed and demonstrated. Nuclear is safer than coal, safer than oil, safer than gas, and safer than hydropower by a long margin. Major actuarial studies by the European Union give the same finding. Say what you like about actuaries, they're pretty unemotional in the way they do their work. They let the numbers do the talking, and the numbers talk very clearly and give that finding. I have seen this energy future, but it's going to take some creating. I hope I might have been able to convince some of you to do the creating with me. Thank you.
Dr. Yoshida.
Good evening. I'm very happy to be here with you to talk about nuclear issues. Let me speak on behalf of people whom I met in Fukushima and the people who are still suffering at Fukushima. Well, Fukushima was one of the biggest tragedies in our long history, 2,000 years history. And that accident triggered nuclear fuel meltdowns at 3 nuclear reactors. This is the first time in our history. And of course, it released huge amount of radiation, and the spread of radioactivities displaced as many as 100,000 people, and many of them still away from their hometown. And recently, the government said people cannot go back to their hometown area around nearby nuclear power plant for decades, not months or years, for decades. Mothers in Japan, they have strong worry about health of children because children are more sensitive to radioactivities. Yes, of course, this cancer risk is a very important issue. But on top of that, maybe greater health risks may come from psychological stress. After Chernobyl accident, many evacuees there have experienced so-called post-traumatic stress disorder. For short, it is called PTSD. And this PTSD risk may become even greater at Fukushima because people are more informed about risk of radiation. Well, human beings can make mistakes. It is true in Japan, but also true globally. I think this is a message from Fukushima. Thank you very much for your attention.
Michael Unwin.
Nuclear power is a response to the world's economic growth aspirations. It became available as one of the answers to those aspirations in the second half of the 20th century. Those aspirations needed continuous, reliable supplies of electricity for large populations. Before nuclear, most of that came from coal and oil, but nuclear grew to become a major alternative source of supply, especially in the OECD. The USA is a classic case of a growing population which needed large-scale electricity supply, including nuclear power, to meet its aspirations to rising prosperity. France, where nuclear energy supplies the largest proportion of electricity of any country, is a case of a national consensus to build a nuclear industry to avoid energy insecurity in the wake of the first global oil crisis in the 1970s. Japan is a case of a country with few energy resources of its own, where creating large-scale electricity supply based partly on nuclear power was necessary to build a first world economy. Nuclear power is part of the world today because it helps make possible the historical drive towards prosperity and a decent way of life, and it is now embedded in the economies of many countries. The aspiration to prosperity will be a strong driver of economic growth, especially in Asia, where people want for themselves and for their children the kind of prosperity we have sitting comfortably here in Sydney, one of the richest cities in the world. And who is prepared to stand up and argue that they can't? So, not only more people, but more people with bigger ambitions and aspirations. Meeting those needs still requires continuous, reliable supplies of electricity. Nuclear power is one of the means for guaranteeing that supply within a diverse electricity generation portfolio. I have seen the future, and it is this. Not all countries will choose nuclear power. Not all countries will keep their nuclear power industries. But the future is already largely written, and it is one in which the nuclear industry has a continuing role in a diverse global portfolio of electricity generating technologies. Thank you.
Dominic LaFontaine.
Good evening. I've seen the energy future, and it is one in which electricity, indeed all energy, is generated safely and cleanly and is used conservatively and intelligently and predominantly generated by renewable resources in a much more integrated, complex way that relies much more on distributed generation than it does today. In the future, the human race will know that to sustain this planet, the one on which we derive our entire well-being, we must only use safe, low-emission, clean energy technologies. Nuclear may be available, but it is not inevitable. And with the reality that the risks that the utilisation of nuclear presents are just too significant, I argue that the energy future is by no means a nuclear one. And yes, to support renewables growth, subsidies are necessary, and these do need to rise, although the subsidy cost per unit output is expected to decline, and there will be lasting energy security and environmental benefits. And of course, many argue that the best way to achieve a level playing field for renewables with conventional fuels is to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. And according to the IEA, currently about $630 billion are spent on fossil fuel subsidies every year, whereas only $65 billion go into renewable energy support. And in two of the countries that are rethinking their nuclear ambitions, changes are afoot as government and business refocus exploiting renewable resources. In Germany, the future of nuclear is over and legislation has been passed to phase out nuclear energy by 2022. Renewables will provide 35% of energy by 2022 and the country has an 80% renewable energy target. In Japan, the Toshiba Corporation and the tsunami-wrecked city of Minamasoma have agreed to build a gigantic solar plants at a cost of 30 billion yen to assist in the recovery of the disasters.
Professor Danny Stelly.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to bring us back home a little. Australians continue to live in a world of paradoxes, perhaps a world a little bit like Alice in Wonderland. 3 examples for you of these paradoxes. First of all, despite being a nation that has a global reputation for a rapid take-up of new technologies, such as mobile phones, when it comes to how we make our energy, we seem quite comfortable with remaining stuck in the 19th century and live with the consequences. Secondly, when we have a choice between farmland and energy, we choose energy. As a consequence, we're destroying some of Australia's best and most productive soil in our demand for energy. Where are we going to grow our food? Thirdly, while we seem quite sanguine about allowing our uranium to be sold overseas and used by others, we deliberately avoid these important resources to support our own energy demands. Nuclear energy is just not salient to us all as Australians. What do I mean by salient? I mean that it just isn't important. It isn't relevant. And that's because of our addiction to coal. We are therefore ignoring the very important national conversation that should be happening all around us. Do we seriously think that wind and solar will feed all of our demands? Current evidence shows that it cannot meet our increasing demands for continuous, reliable electricity supply. We ignore these facts. We ignore them at our peril. Our lack of involvement in these discussions and this decision-making means the future is being written for us. These facts are already known. We don't need new research. But we do need an education program outside of a political and cultural pressure that will enable us to make these important decisions for a sustainable future. This will then enable us all to help shape our future. Thank you.
Professor Ian Lowe.
The new generation of reactors which will solve all our problems is what I think is the perpetual delusion of the nuclear industry. I've been involved in looking at nuclear energy for more than 40 years, and throughout all of that time we have consistently been assured that a new generation of reactors is on the drawing board that will be cleaner, cheaper, safer and not have the problems of the existing ones. Now, just because people have been consistently wrong for 40 years doesn't mean they'll always be wrong, but it does mean that their assurances should be taken with at least a shovelful of salt. The first commercial nuclear power station was Calder Hall in the UK, and its commercial generation of electricity was a public relations stunt to distract attention from the fact that the real purpose of Calder Hall was to produce plutonium for the British bomb. We have a national addiction to cheap coal, and that's obviously true. Witness the hysterical reaction to a modest charge on carbon dioxide emissions and the continued repetition of the barefaced lie that this will be the world's biggest carbon tax. I spent 5 minutes on the web and I found that Sweden and Norway introduced carbon charges of more like $100 a tonne 20 years ago. So to say that $23 a tonne in 2012 prices is the world's biggest carbon tax is an exaggeration of which any politician should be proud. And obviously they are, because they keep saying it. Now, I worry when people say we need education, because education is one of those irregular verbs. I educate, he propagandises, they brainwash. When people say they want an education program, what they usually mean is they want a program that will persuade us that they are right and we historically have been wrong. But I remind you that 50 years ago, nuclear power was promoted as clean, cheap and safe. It's now widely seen as expensive, dirty and dangerous. The two fundamental problems identified by the Ranger Inquiry, radioactive waste management and the prevention of weapons proliferation, remain unsolved 35 years later. There is a clean energy future. 20 years ago, the Department of Resources and Energy said that we could get all our energy from renewables by 2030. Last year, Beyond Zero Emissions said we could get it by 2020. Last year in Australia, with no fuss, no protests, no nonsense in the media, 837 megawatts of solar power was installed in Australia by individuals and small companies. That's equivalent to the output of a large nuclear power station, and it was done cleanly, quietly and effectively. I've seen the future. It's large deployment of small-scale renewables. It's the clean energy future that we should all support.
But before we even hear the results, so that your applause isn't conditioned by the outcome, let's just thank our marvellous panel of speakers: Ben Hurd, Michael Angwin, Danielle Stelly, Kunihiko Yoshida, Dominic Lefebvre, Emily Rowe. Well done. Now, the result. Okay, so the undecided had dropped right down to 16.8%. The against had gone from 30.6 to 31.6%, but winning the debate by a huge margin, by 51.4%. So, ladies and gentlemen, I declare the motion carried in the affirmative. I wish you all a very good night and declare the debate closed. Thank you.